Yeah, either one.
Okay. And I need to share the screen.
I think you have.
It's shared. Okay. All right.
I'll get in here so I can see humans.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Can somebody give me a thumbs up?
I can hear you, Ian.
Great, thank you. And can you see the screen all right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming to my presentation. This CPD is on Indigenous Diacritics and Unicode. A trip down a rabbit hole. So I hope you enjoy it and maybe find it interesting. Give me a moment. Figure out how to move, advance the
I
slide.
think the space bar.
Spacebar. There we go. All right. We would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Yellowknives, Dene and Chief Drygees territory as part of Treaty 8 in Yellowknife Northwest Territories. We also acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of the Cleachow and the North Slave Métis Alliance. You will notice that Cleachow has Indigenous diacritics in it, and there's also an E with an accent aigu, or E with an acute accent for Métis. Nothing in this presentation should be construed as conveying legal advice, any opinion of the government of Northwest Territories or of the Law Society of Northwest Territories. This presentation is for educational purposes and is intended to educate members of the Law Society of Northwest Territories on current legal issues of interest. This CPD was not prepared using generative AI other than the use of internet search engines, which might use generative AI. This CPD is more than just instructing on how to insert a symbol in a word processor. It examines what is Unicode, but it goes further and looks into detail and Unicode as it applies to Indigenous diacritics. For lawyers, the CPD should remind them of the diversity and inclusion when it comes to language and information technology and writing. From a practice perspective, how to properly employ Unicode is presented. Some deficiencies in current programs will be discussed and shown. And while the focus is on Indigenous diacritics in the Northwest Territories, these issues equally apply to Indigenous syllabics, Indigenous diacritics throughout Canada, and all diacritics in languages other than in English. I have a list of references here with hyperlinks. So when this PowerPoint presentation is shared, you will have all this information. In terms of the references, there's a Canadian Guide to the Uniform Preparation of Judgments, which was done in 2002. It's available on Canly. There is lots of information with respect to Unicode on the internet, provided by the Unicode organization. There is an entity called denefont.com, which is the current legacy fonts, if you've ever heard of that. I think I tried to install that at one of the CPDs, and you'll notice we didn't have that problem this time around. Emojis are also discussed, some articles about emojis. The GMWT Education, Culture and Employment Department, they have a very good website that has some information on the use of Indigenous diacritics, letters, and accents. Not so much on syllabics. If you're interested in syllabics, you should probably have a look at the Government of Nunavut website. There is GNWT Policy 71.09, Geographical and Community Names. If one ever wanted to know about toponyms, that speaks to toponyms, which is place names. There is a slight tangential issue of honor of crown, and I've put in a brief prepared by University of Calgary. There's legal knowledge and information systems. There's some sort of document there from Canley as well. And another article on legal information from, it's one of the SLAW blogs. Michel Bastarache, his book, The Law of Bilingual Interpretation, is worth having a look at because of the apparent equality of status in terms of the law that's set out in legislation. He certainly discusses that. That's the whole point of that book. There's the Official Languages Act of the Northwest Territories. There's a number of sources with respect to syllabics. Que pense les tribunaux des emojis, emoticon, et autres pictogrammes. So there's another article there from the McGill Law Journal. In French, we are a bilingual jurisdiction. There's a series of sources here dealing with technological competency, which is an aspect of ethics, and we will discuss that. And then there's the actual Unicode websites. And so there's their homepage and then a link to their database. There's about 145,000 different Unicode characters. So with the ability to scale up to 1.4 million, I think. Here we have the intersection of different subject matters. There is a technical term for these sorts of diagrams. It's called a meronymy. So there's an intersection of legal practice and skills, Indigenous languages and official languages, diversity, inclusion, and computer science and information technology. So this is the outline that I have developed for this presentation. We start with an introduction where we talk about basic concepts in linguistics of glyphs, diacritics, and early efforts to standardize. We will talk about CW, which is Morse code, going into ASCII, UTF, and onwards into what is now the Unicode standard version 15.1 as of the fall of last year. We'll discuss code charts, briefly the database, and then combining diacritics, which is a very interesting operation. Applied problems in Word and WordPerfect will be sort of considered. Probably won't get into LibreOffice because it's not actually installed on this system, but LibreOffice is actually quite advanced and it is as good as Word when it comes to diacritics. It's also open source. It's an open source Office package. So there's more to inserting a symbol than meets the eye, and we'll have a look at that. We'll talk about the legacy fonts that are used by GNWT. That was denefonts.com. The conversion tool that is offered by ECE, we're actually going to have a look at the code. What is a hexadecimal number? I'm sure some people don't know what a hexadecimal means, so we will discuss that. And why it's important. We'll then have a look at legal context, looking at statutory considerations, the actual GNWT policy regarding toponyms, the problem of the dotted I with the ogonek, the honor of the crown, and then professional ethical considerations. We'll do a quick search of case law in Canley, and then have a look at the judicial decisions document that I had mentioned. This is part of legal content. And then we'll briefly discuss emojis and diversity and inclusion. So with that, we'll start with this CPD. A glyph, what we commonly call a letter is also called a glyph. The letter A is called a graphem, that's lowercase a, the smallest functional unit of a writing system. Variations in the way A is represented are known as allographs. We might call them fonts, but a font could be a bunch of letters, right? So an allograph is an individual letter. So here we see differences in the letter A as represented by different fonts that I selected. Aptos, of course, is the standard Microsoft font. Unless you haven't updated your Microsoft software lately. A is the stencil. Obviously, it's uppercase because that's just the way the font is. Arial, Calibri, Old English text, and then Comic Sans. So those are just examples of different forms of allographs. Well, it's the same. Yeah. So they're just allographs. Most languages use variations on the Latin alphabet in such a way that two graphemes are used, such as an E with an acute accent, which is the funny little thing on top of it, to produce the E with the accent aigu. The E accent aigu is collectively known as a diacritic, comprising E and, of course, the accent itself. These are sometimes used in English, but invariably these words are imported from other languages. So, for example, facade is stolen from French. And you can see that there's that squiggly thing under the C. That squiggly thing is called a cedille or a cedilla. I suspect it's used in Spanish. Now I realize cedille is not there, but la cedille ne s'emploie qu'avec la lettre C devant les voyelles O, U, et A. Okay, so the cedille is only employed with the letter C in front of vowels O, U, and A. The cedille serves to indicate that one must not pronounce k, but rather s or s. So, for example, sava, facade. So you can see that the diacritics are linked intricately to pronunciation. English is notorious for its lack of diacritics. Early efforts to standardize the languages of the world started off with Morse code, and we had international Morse code. And if you look at international Morse code, got a little exhibit there on the side. It's all uppercase or case insensitive. And you can see there's no diacritics whatsoever in it. And why is that? Probably because Morse code was invented by Samuel Morse, US, English speaking. And it was inadequate then. So there are variations in Morse code to adopt punctuation and also to adopt things such as the E accent aigu. In the 1960s, computing started to become developed, as did teletype. And we started with the American National Standards Institute, 128 characters, symbols. So your QWERTY keyboard on your computer was originally intended for 128 characters. That's 2 to the power 7. 2 is an important number because it's basis of binary. In the 1980s, this started to become inadequate because of the global impact of computing, other languages now, the rise of emoticons, and international languages, and then indigenous languages, and non-Latin languages as well. So what happened was they started then with UTF, Unicode transformation format, 2 to the 8th. They went up to 255 characters. Then UTF-8 is probably what your keyboard is, or at least the DOS system. If you go into the PowerShell in Windows, what used to be called DOS. Then they went up to UTF-16, 2 to the 16, right? And in 1991, they realized all of these were inadequate. And they started to develop Unicode. So first standard for Unicode came out. We are now in 2023, and we are at version 15.1. There are 145,000 characters currently identified, and it's capable of handling approximately 1.2 million. So let's have a look at Unicode standard 15.1. Just some highlights. Covers most writing systems in use today. These are linguistic terms, which probably don't need to know much about, but I just put them in there for reference. Alphabets. So we have an example of an alphabet on the leftmost panel. I can't recall what the symbol is. It might be some form of runes or something like that. Or then we have guidas, right? And then syllabaries. So the bottom image is a syllabary, and it's Plains Cree. The far right-hand stop sign is not Northwest Territories. It's I think it's Navajo, and it's another Indigenous language. We have some form of, I believe it's a Japanese script right next to it. And then there's all sorts of strange and interesting ones. These are looks like some variations on Sanskrit for the Indian subcontinent, and then, excuse me, Southeast Asia, another variation of characters. So Unicode 15.1 came out in September of 2023. And that is the hyperlink to it. It was founded in 1988. It's a not-for-profit organization. Open source standards, data, software development. It orchestrates the contributions of hundreds of professionals, expert volunteers, and language experts. There are 30 plus organizational members. It's funded by membership dues and donations. Fundamentally, computers just deal with numbers. They store letters and other characters by assigning a number for each character. Before the Unicode standard was developed, there were many different systems called character encodings for assigning these numbers, such as the UTF series. These earlier character encodings were limited and did not cover characters for all the world's languages. Even for a single language like English, no single encoding covered all letters, punctuation, and technical symbols in common use. Pictographic languages, such as Japanese, were a challenge to support with these earlier encoding standards. Early character encodings also conflicted with one another. That is, two encodings could use the same number for two different characters or use different numbers for the same character. Any given computer might have to support many different encodings. However, when data is passed between computers and different encodings, it increased the risk for data corruption and errors. Character encodings existed for large languages, but many languages lacked character support altogether. Here is an interesting map of all the family of different languages. The gray area is the Latin. Okay, so you might ask, what did the Romans ever do for us? And there you go. So Latin languages are quite significant, at least in terms of territory. In Russia, the Russia area, you see Cyrillic, and Greek is slightly below there. Those are related. Cyrillic and Greek are actually related. Then we have the Arabic family, and then various Asian ones, including North Indic, South Indic, Hansi, and etc. The following is pulled straight from the Unicode documentation. It illustrates or exemplifies common components found in entries in the character names list. These and other components are described in more detail in that section. So we see here, for example, there's the R sign. Some of you may recognize that as, oh, there's only one person here. What does R in a circle mean? Registered trademark. So it's a registered sign, registered trademark. And there is a code there, 00 alpha echo. What on earth is that? That is called a hexadecimal number. Okay, so hexadecimal number means it's a number to the base 16. Okay. When we talk about a decimal number, it's a number to the base 10. Okay. Well, 10. So you count up 1, 0 to 9, and then you're at 10. So suddenly there's a 10 column, right? In your expression of numbers. That's the base 10. But the base 16 is 2 to the 16. So every time you reach 15, you're going to have some sort of indication that marks the change. Okay. There is a, if you go onto your computer, in control of my mouse here. If I go onto the computer and I open up the calculator, See if this works. Here is the calculator in Windows. And if I go into the menu and have a look at, either go to programming or scientific, I'll go to programming. Here you can see hex, dec, oct, bin. We're only interested in hexadecimal numbers and decimal numbers, okay? So if I were to type in hexadecimal number 0, 0, alpha, echo. The 2 zeros didn't show up because they're leading zeros, they're meaningless, it's sort of like 0, 1, 0 in decimal format. And and you can see here the decimal number has been converted automatically. It's the equivalent of 174. But it's using a base system of 16. And we're not going to talk about octal and binary. There's the binary number, so that's base 2. The reason why this is important is because this is the way in which all these symbols are indexed in the Unicode system. So every single character has a unique hexadecimal number. You could convert that to binary if you could convert that to binary. You could convert that to decimal if you wish. Benefit of converting it to decimal is that a lot of people don't know what a hexadecimal is. And if you're trying to communicate the details of this to somebody, they're probably going to get lost. The Unicode character database is located at that website. Remember, there's 145,000 of them, possibly more now. Characters versus glyphs. So if you remember the A, we had various variations on the letter A. So there's uppercase A and lowercase a. And U plus is a way of indicating Unicode. Okay, and then it's the coding 0041. So if I type in 0041, and if I were to do Shift Control U in LibreOffice, it's going to show me that letter. And I'm just going to demonstrate that by well, I will demonstrate that. I'm not going to do it right now. In the case of Word, you can do it by typing in 0. You can ignore the zeros because they're just leading zeros. You type in 41 and then do Alt X, and what will appear will be the letter capital A. If you were to type in Alt X 41, capital A is going to show up. Okay, so the Alt X is an important feature in Word that can go back and forth. And you can see we can do that with Arabic letters and so forth. What you need to know is the code that you're after. Linguistic usage. So just as a demonstration, again, from the Unicode standard, you can see that CH combined is typically used in Slovak or Spanish. Various Native American languages use these other characters. Those characters relate to a code point. There's A, letter A with the accent aigu, and there's something underneath it. I can't tell what that is, but it's based in Lithuanian. And then there's a kana character, it's the last entry, which is a form of Japanese script. Combining diacritics. It is possible to combine diacritics. You can see here that there is the letter A, Unicode, and it's U plus 0041. And the O, or that little circly thing that's broken, that's just a marker. The important thing is what's there is those 2 dots. That's called, so we know what that's called? I believe it's called an umlaut. Okay, typically in German and other languages. And what you can see that the number is in the 300s. Okay, well, it's not 300s, that would be wrong. It's a hexadecimal number because 100 is a decimal number, right? So it'd be wrong to call it in the hundreds. The hexadecimal number is 0308. Okay. And what you can do is it's reserved as 0308. Those numbers are reserved in a block for combinations. So you can actually combine certain diacritics with letters. And in this case, you can combine it just by typing in Alt-X or A, and then Alt-X 308, and you'll get the A with the umlaut on top of it. That is a combined diacritic. When referring to code points, you could, in the Unicode standard, practices to refer to them by their numeric value in hexadecimal with U+ prefix. Sequence of base characters of combining characters. It doesn't matter the order in which you do it. So here's an example with A. You attach the umlaut after the A, it's going to be put on the A, not on the U. And there's a series of multiple combining of characters. And there is also a verbal description as to what these things mean. So for example, the A with that squiggly on top, which is a tilde, is a Latin small letter A with tilde. Or it could be combining it. This is the chart of the 0300 series that was snatched from the internet. And you can see here all of the various combinations. So for example, if we look at 308, 308, there's the umlaut. Okay. Word. In Word, there's something called the insert symbol. So if you go to that ribbon, you'll see insert and then there's a symbol, or there's a, if you have symbols on the ribbon, it's the big omega thing. When you call up the dialog box, you've got the symbols, and then you've got a subset, basic Latin. And then in that left bottom circle, you can see it says Unicode name, Latin capital S. That's what's been selected in the chart. And then character code 0053, and that's in Unicode or hexadecimal format. You can actually select that drop-down box to select decimal if you want. This is the legacy font, one of the legacy fonts, which we'll discuss, and it's Win-Max Dulestene. And you can see that unlike the previous slide, we actually have the Indigenous Diacritics as part of the font set. And you can see that where the L with the slash is, the lowercase l. This approach uses allographs. It's not proper Unicode. It's also the approach that WordPerfect uses. And you've got to realize that in the 1990s, this is when these denefonts.com, this is one of the denefonts.com parts. When these fonts were developed in the early to mid 90s, remember that Unicode didn't quite exist. Only the Unicode organization only was founded in 1991. That's when the Unicode #1 showed up. So what typically happens with legacy fonts, if you were to go into our legislation and look at, say, any piece of legislation and copy and paste it into Word, you will end up with this type of error that's in that third to last bullet point. You get these strange looking symbols. And the reason why you're getting those strange looking symbols is because that's the normal text. It's not Unicode, but it's how the WinMax Sildulis Dene legacy font functions. So it's not wrong, but it's not Unicode. And remember that WordPerfect doesn't support Unicode. Word does. So we have here a difference between normal text and Unicode. So that's why we have that error. If you see those sorts of errors, that's an indication immediately that somebody is using the legacy fonts. And if and you haven't actually applied the legacy font to whatever document you've pasted it into. This is taken from the ASCII website, list of specialized letters and accents. And here they've got the Unicode, okay, in the standard format. And you can see a description of how these words sound. So for example, the L with the stroke, an L with a stroke is used to indicate a breathy L. Found in words like flip or flip is often following a T as in flicho, where it may sound closer to th than a TL. And that's interesting because in the Welsh language, double L is pronounced that way. It's cl. So it's like Clondaf, or clan means a church, right? Double L. Or LLOYD is pronounced Cloyd. Or Llewellyn is another one. Not Llewellyn, but Llewellyn. Except they don't use diacritics, they use lots of consonants. So here's another example, a turned E. Okay. I haven't actually seen the turned E in legislation, but I'm sure it could theoretically come up. There's an E with a diaresis. And you can see that they have, as one would expect with diacritics, they have a phonetic quality. Here we have the accent graph. You can see it's used in these indigenous languages. Of course, it's also used in French. And then the accent acute, and then this ogonek. So the ogonek looks like a sedi, but it's not a sedi, because if you think about the sedi, it goes the other way. So it's a reverse sedi. And you can see sometimes the sedi is not quite centered on the character. And then the macron is occasionally used as well. And that's just the letter with the, or I guess it's a vowel with the bar on top. So here's information on the denefont.com website. And they talk about the legacy fonts. There is a utility to convert. Some of their website is not functioning properly. Some of it is, and they have an interesting keyboard, and they have the O with the diacritics on it, that broken O. That threw me off for a while until I figured out what it was. Caution is recommended on these resources, even though they are cited by ASCII. Some of the online conversation interfaces do not work. The conversion VB script, so VB is Visual Basic, changes all accented characters to combine diacritics, even for instance, the E with the accent, like U. The E accent of U is actually a recognized UTF character. So it's my favorite, Alt 130 on the keyboard. So the VB script was designed in an English-only environment with a view to changing only English text. Because it's Visual Basic, it only works in Word. Theoretically, Visual Basic is supposed to work in WordPerfect, but I don't understand how it could if it doesn't support Unicode. So the legacy fonts date from about 1995, and the purpose of the VP script is to actually push it into Unicode version 15.1, but that will only work on Word. And it poses a problem in our legislation because our legislation is side by side English and French. So if you were to apply that, even if the Visual Basic did work and you were to apply that, what it would do is it would change all of the French diacritics to Aboriginal diacritics, or the French characters to Aboriginal diacritics. Legacy fonts still have to be used for software that is not Unicode compatible. So, for example, WordPerfect, the cut and paste text error will still arise. If anybody uses Linux, there is it's the same problem between LibreOffice, which is Unicode compliant, and ASCII Word, which is not. With Unicode, one can exploit key shortcuts. So for example, the E with the accent aigu can be produced simply by typing Alt 130 in most environments. But more complex ones can be handled by Word, but not by other software. So even the Alt codes being used in PowerPoint, for example, don't work. But there is a way around that. It's to copy and paste what you produced in Word and paste it into PowerPoint. And that's what I did with Clicho at the beginning with the caveat. Incidentally, if you're using Linux, Linux actually is Unicode compliant in its terminal, which is bizarre. Because that means you can produce like file names with Unicode characters. Weird. I don't know how that would look if you were trying to open it up in the PowerShell. You can look up key codes online. There are some indexes that are available. The ogonek with the accent aigu, in my view, this is the most complex diacritic in the Northwest Territories. In Word, what you can do is find the diacritic for the undotted I, Alt plus 305. Okay, now I'm using decimal numbers here. Okay, so you don't need to use the Alt X, so that will give you the Unicode in hexadecimal. So it's just Alt 305 will give you the I, or you could just type in I. It's the same thing. And I type in Alt 769, and that'll put on the accent aigu. And then to find the ogonek, the reverse cedilla, it's Alt 808. So if I type those three in sequence, Alt 305, Alt 769, and Alt 808, or if you want it, I could also do it in hexadecimal, which is what's in brackets there. Okay, 131 Alt X, and then 301 Alt X, and then 328 Alt X, if you remember the 300 block. And then I will get the I with the accent aigu and the ogonek, and that's what it looks like. We've been through the transition between hexadecimal and decimal. I jumped that. So there's three ways of inputting Unicode into your document. One is through the character map. One is through the decimal input, and one is through hexadecimal input. 146,000 possible characters, and probably more if one uses the combined diacritics feature. We got strange possibilities, okay, if you're creative. So here's the Unicode for the euro symbol, and then I've stuck a cedilla on it. Okay, it's fanciful, but it's a demonstration of the use of Unicode. However, when you're doing this, you have to be certain that the software is capable of handling it. Let's have a look at the substantive legal component now that we've gone through this practice. So if you remember in the Official Languages Act, The preamble speaks to spoken languages and not written languages. And I've got some extracts from the preamble, recognizing so speaking Indigenous languages, spoken dialects. It's an interesting question why written isn't there. Now, one could argue that the Diacritics does reflect, or do reflect spoken language. But it's an interesting question about written languages, especially for a society that was not originally familiar with writing in this form. That's not to say they weren't familiar with recording things physically. So I always think about the wampum belt example. Not for this jurisdiction, but the wampum belt, of course, theoretically was a method of recording things physically. But consider the substantive provisions in the Official Languages Act. So we can see that we have a listing here of all the official languages in the Northwest Territories. And then we have section 5, to the extent and manner provided in this act and any regulations under this act, so that's legislation. The official languages of the territories have equality of status and equal rights and privileges as to the use in all government institutions. So that sets up legal rights. It's not unlike the status of English and French, except that French and English are very much constitutionally rooted in the Constitution of Canada. And that would also include syllabics, the northern syllabics, possibly even Cree, because we do have Cree here. So here's the Guanayuja Kuwait syllabics, and forgive me of my pronunciation. I'm not familiar with the pronunciation of that word. We've got Inuktitut, and we've also got Eastern Canadian Inuktitut. Syllabics are used in Inuktitut, and then Roman orthography is also used. And this chart is from ASCII, and it shows the equivalencies. I haven't actually seen syllabics in the Northwest Territories, but they may be in use. Certainly, they're in use in Nunavut. You can see again with the syllabics, they are related to the sounds, and that's what these double consonants are. We saw that with one of the European languages, with Slovak. Further bits from the Official Languages Act, either English or French may be used in person in any pleading or process issuing from any court in the legislature. Then we've got the Indigenous languages may be used by any person in a court established by the legislature. Doesn't say which court this is. A court, presumably it's all courts. And this section of the Official Languages Act ties into the revitalization of Indigenous languages in Northwest Territories. And so every time you use these diacritics, it's tying into that goal because you are helping to preserve their orthography, which is part of our orthography. Toponyms, place names. So there is a GNWD policy on this. Research into the origin, pronunciation, correct spelling, and orthography. And history, use of name of physical feature or populated place. There is a process outlined for giving Indigenous names to places, and frequently we see the orthography appearing in them. Now, this is a policy, captain policy. In terms of its legal significance, it's probably cabinet prerogative. I'm not sure I would call it a form of legislation. I think you would probably need an order in council for that, or an order in executive council, I guess is the proper term. The I with the ogonek, is it dotted or not? So I've got some variations. So we can see the first one, Delaney, and it's got a peculiar E with a circumflex or a chapeau on top of it. That is clearly a orthography error, probably because I copied it from something which was using legacy fonts. Delaney with the circumflex again on the I, that's probably a similar incorrect variation. Same with the third one. And I think the last one there is a further error, and I think you'll find that's the one in the federal website. So you're looking at all sorts of variations when you go online, and it's largely because a lot of the website content management systems are incapable of handling the Unicode 15.1. However, if we have a look at the EIA website and actually look at the agreement, you can see there it is. Here's the cover page. It has an I on it, a dotted I with the ogonek. ECE suggested it doesn't have the dot on it. Is it something to lose sleep over? I don't know. Have they made a spelling error there? I don't know. And this raises interesting questions about how written language evolves and names evolve. So when many immigrants were coming over to Canada in the 19th century from Eastern Europe or even from Ireland, they had complex names, and quite often the customs or the immigration officer would simply shorten their name. So
As an example, starting.
yeah, so an interesting
What's supposed to be spelled.
an interesting question. The Honor of the Crown. So this is an extract from the University of Calgary, and in the notes that I have, which you can't see, I do have a number of the citations, which are the numbers in brackets, replicated. The reason I've done that is because there's various case law that's being referenced. So my question is, does the failure to use Indigenous languages properly constitute a failure to meet the obligations that are posed by the concept of the honor of the crown? And it probably does. There's probably a duty on the part of government to actually be using the Indigenous diacritics. Perhaps we can discuss that later if there's time. In terms of ethical considerations for lawyers, is this whole issue of technological competency. So we can see here the model code is amended from the Law Society of Northwest Territories. Page 8, advances in technology, changes in the culture of those accessing legal services, and the economics associated with practicing law will continue to present challenges to lawyers, and this is certainly in that realm. And recall the definition of what is a competent lawyer. Means a lawyer who has and applies relevant knowledge, skill, and attributes in a manner appropriate to each matter undertaken on behalf of a client, and the nature and terms of a lawyer's engagement. And then there's a list. But I would think that if you're not spelling the Indigenous languages properly with their diacritics, that might be of concern. And then there's also the quality of service. From the Law Society of Alberta, there's the practice essentials. Lawyers are required to maintain technological competence. They should understand the technology they use and their practices, and should understand its risks and benefits. Lawyers also have an obligation to supervise employees or consultants to ensure that they maintain technological competence. Part of that is also understanding the limitations of the technology. Law Society of British Columbia had an e-brief issued in March of this year. And it follows the cases involving AI, where somebody was using ChatGPT-4 to, it's the Zhang case. They were using ChatGPT-4 to do their legal research, and it was citing fictitious cases. Code amendments regarding technological competence. The effective use of technology has become an essential element of responsible legal practice. While the Code of Professional Conduct already provides extensive guidance on standards for lawyer competence, the impact of technology on contemporary delivery of legal services merits specific guidance for lawyers on the use of technology. And what they've done is they've added a series of commentaries. Federation of Law Society of Canada added a commentary, and this person, Amy Salzman, and she also produced an article on the SLAW law blog. Federation changed its commentary at Rules 3.1-2 and added new comments for A and 4B. So there's the 4A and 4B comments. Exactly what I said. Quick Canley search of Unicode reveals only 8 hits, 3 cases and 5 commentaries. It's not many. I've got a listing here of the commentaries. And what is of interest is Canadian Guide to Uniform Preparation of Judgments, 2002, which is kind of old. So it is available on that website, which is not the Canley website. And it's also the same one where it comes from the recommendation of neutral case citations. Anybody has run into that? I certainly have. Notice in their case citations, they've got doc, which is the old format for Word. They also have WPD, WordPerfect. So here's some bits which I've highlighted, which I thought were interesting. So the whole point of efficient dissemination of documents requires adhesion to established standards and practices regarding file name extensions. They seem to be preoccupied with file name extensions. The text has to be, they've suggested a format for the text in these judgments should be in ASCII, ANSI, or Unicode. So 2002, you're looking at a very early version of Unicode. You can see the formats that they're identifying include RTF, which is fine. It's a very common format. Microsoft Word, okay. WordPerfect, all right. Star Office Writer. Star Office Writer, I think, is defunct. And I think it's also generally DOS-based. Lotus, Word Pro, or ME Pro. That's history, it's gone. XML, okay. HTML, right. Has the requirement to make use of Indigenous diacritics changed the landscape? How often does one see Indigenous diacritics in case reports on Canley? And on official websites with primary sources of law, such as statutes and regulations? You certainly see it on ours. Electronic evidence, e-discovery, Sedona principles. I'm not sure why I put those comments in there, but they seem to be missing from what's up here. Sedona principles relates to e-discovery and the format of documents. So there's practice directions, or there were practice directions on that subject. It's another CPD. Emojis are considered to be a subset of Unicode. Put this out there, technological colonialism. So if you have a look at these articles about emojis, you will find that emojis tend to be directed at very white people. Okay. And so there is a problem with respect to diversity and inclusion in that respect. And that problem is also reflective of the ANSI 128 standard, 128 characters originally for computing. And it was in English only. And same with Morse code, English only. And it represents, yes, the Western countries were the first ones to be industrialized, but now everybody else is coming on board. And it shows a deficiency with respect to the way the technology was designed initially. Given that Unicode is ever evolving and that this 2002 document dates to probably about 1996, it proposed that we're having a glimpse into the future as practices are changing with technology and indigenous languages are being accommodated more and more by technology. And so is diversity and inclusion. So here is an example of some of the little bit more diversity in respect of emojis. And it's something called Fitzpatrick modifiers, and it's in use on Facebook apparently. But you can also see that it's not entirely inclusive because it's still rooted in the binary system of gender. But remember that Unicode has the capability of being scaled up to 100 or 1.2 million characters. So maybe you are looking at the future. So in summary, we've had a quick overview of linguistics, glyphs, diacritics, and early efforts to standardize, CW, ANSI, UTF. We've had a look at the Unicode standard 15.1. We've looked at code charts, databases, and combining of diacritics. We've looked at applied problems in Word and WordPerfect and LibreOffice to some extent. There's more than just inserting a symbol involved. We've had a look at the legacy fonts for the GNWT. We didn't look at the actual code for the conversion tool, but we've discussed it. We've talked about hexadecimal numbers and why that's important. We've gone through legal content beyond legal practice. So we've had a look at statutory considerations, particularly the Official Languages Act. We've looked at GNWT policy regarding toponyms, the daughter to I with the ogonek problem, the honor of the crown, professional ethical considerations, primarily looking at model codes in Northwest Territories, Alberta, and British Columbia. We did a quick case law search. We've had a look at judicial decisions, that judicial decisions document, and then we did a very brief overview of emojis and diversity and inclusion. So are there any questions? I see that we're at 1 o'clock, but I do have a list of questions. Are there any questions before we move to the next slide? Okay, with that, I'll go to the next slide. So here's some thought-provoking questions. If the legacy font approach works, why bother with Unicode? I think the answer is clear. It's because it's a universal standardization. Legacy fonts are not universal standardization. They only apply to the Northwest Territories. Should lawyers be concerned with Unicode? Isn't this a matter for typist secretaries and maybe IT people? Well, we've already gone over the ethical issues. Absolutely not. It ties into technological competency. Should we be critical of those who fail to use Unicode? For example, the Justice Canada Laws website, or even legislation division. So legislation division is making use of legacy fonts. I don't think we should. And the reason why is Justice Canada, they probably have limitations in respect of their content management system. Legislation division is making, as I said, is making use of the legacy fonts. But if you also look at the things that are generated on the HTML pages, you'll find they don't have the Indigenous diacritics in them. And that's a limitation with the software. So as the software develops, what you're probably going to find is more and more accommodation. So the ability to employ the technology is not something that can happen overnight, but we are aware of it. I think the EIA website actually uses Unicode in its content management system. Is Unicode a hopeful sign that technology can accommodate diversity and inclusion? I think it is. Is rendering a spoken-only language to writing not a form of colonialism? That's an open question, and there's probably a paper in that. I don't have an answer to that. It's an interesting question. Is the use of the Roman alphabet not colonialism? Maybe we're all, or at least in the West, we're all victims of Roman colonialism. So when I made that clip about what have the Romans ever done for us, just a Monty Python quote, and it includes roads. So what about syllabics? Or Unicode? Is there such a thing as technological colonialism? Does Unicode help the revitalization of Indigenous languages? So those are all questions for thought, and perhaps controversial questions. So with that, I'll open the floor up again for any questions or comments that anyone may have.
Hi, Ian. It's Simone here. No questions, but thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Thank you, Simone. All right. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, last call for questions or comments. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending this CPD, and I hope it was interesting and thought-provoking. And I'll pass it back to Jessica.
Hey, thanks, everybody. I see people leaving, so I'll just say thank you for joining. Thank you so much, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you. This will be available on our YouTube channel also.
And, oh, did you do that?
I just left.
And meeting for all.